What happens when we stop teaching historical thinking? History as a discipline is currently facing a sustained and highly visible attack. Across public discourse, legislative debate, and educational policy, historical scholarship and historical education itself are being actively undermined, reframed, and in some cases deliberately erased. Claims grounded in decades of archival research, policy analysis, and lived experience, such as the well-documented reality that the United States has long grappled with systemic racial inequality, are increasingly dismissed, not through evidentiary rebuttal, but through political rebranding and rhetorical suspicion. In this environment, the historical method itself is recast as ideology, and historians are portrayed not as analysts of the past, but as partisan actors with ulterior motives. These attacks have concrete consequences. History programs lose funding. Educational standards are narrowed or stripped of their analytical rigor. Curricula are reshaped by individuals and institutions untrained in historical thinking and guided by policy agendas unrelated to how historical knowledge is produced. The result is not a neutral recalibration of priorities, but a public downgrading of historical education, which they treat as expendable rather than foundational to understanding the nation's past and its present. Cutting historical education does not simply reduce knowledge of the past. It produces a deeper and more dangerous problem: epistemic vulnerability and the loss of contextual understanding. These harms are not abstract. When historical education weakens, interpretive authority does not vanish, it shifts. In the absence of a historical method, accounts of the past increasingly take the form of simplified narratives, shaped by sentiment, ideology, and narrative appeal rather than evidence. The result is not ignorance, but distortion. A clear illustration of this dynamic appears in the public understanding of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Popular memory intervened in shaping how both periods were understood. It proved most influential among audiences who lacked widespread training in the historical method, and therefore looked to cultural authorities, so-called experts, artists, educators, politicians, and filmmakers, to interpret those national crises and give them meaning. In that space, some actors operating in bad faith advanced polemical narratives that displaced evidence-based historical analysis. The most consequential of these was the film Birth of a Nation, which translated the myth of the lost cause into a powerful visual narrative that offered a corrupt coherence, moral clarity, and emotional resolution in place of historical complexity. The film did not emerge in isolation. It amplified decades of work by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who had already embedded lost cause interpretations into school textbooks, classroom curricula, and commemorative landscapes through statuary and public ritual. That narrative gained further authority when it received elite political endorsement, including a White House screening hosted by President Woodrow Wilson, lending presidential legitimacy to a distortion of Reconstruction grounded not in historical analysis, but in racial myth. Where historical critique was absent or inaccessible, such narratives found a receptive audience, not because the public was incapable of critical thought, but because it had not been equipped with the tools required to evaluate historical claims. This is what epistemic vulnerability looks like. This is the danger lurking in the present attacks on historical education and scholarship. Truth suffers because people lose the tools to evaluate evidence, sources, and causal claims. Empathy erodes because historical education requires students to understand past actors on their own terms, despite moral, temporal, and circumstantial differences. And without that disciplined practice of perspective taking, it becomes harder to understand contemporary people with whom one disagrees. What protects against this vulnerability is not allegiance to a profession, but access to a method. Historical education trains the capacity to evaluate evidence, weigh causation, and engage human difference without collapsing into moral shorthand. These habits of mind do not emerge automatically, nor are they confined to the academy. They must be taught, practiced, and sustained. This is why history education is a public good rather than an elite privilege. Defending it is not about defending historians. It is about preserving a shared capacity to understand how the present came to be and how it might have been otherwise.